All right, so have you ever thought about this? Like, what if all those tests we take from, IQ tests to personality tests, what if they're not as universal as we think?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, picture this. You sit down for an IQ test, but instead of those, like, usual puzzles and stuff, you're faced with dominoes.
It's not as wild as it sounds. There's an intelligence test they use in Italy. It's called Test G,
Hmm.
and they actually use dominoes to look at reasoning skills.
Dominoes, that's so
Uh,
interesting. And that kind of leads us into what we're talking about today. You gave me all this really fascinating research on adapting tests for different cultures.
yeah.
Educational and psychological tests. We've got excerpts from a book on cross-cultural test adaptation, a study on the Spanish version of the Wechsler intelligence scale. We even have research on using bilinguals to evaluate test versions.
It's a really complex field,
Mm.
and what we're going to try and do today is uncover not only the challenges, but also some of those solutions that researchers are coming up with to make these tests fairer and more accurate across different cultures.
So let's just dive right in and tackle that first big misconception. The idea that you can just translate a test word for word and call it a day.
Right, the quick and dirty method.
Yeah.
While translation is definitely a part of it, it's rarely enough to say for sure that a test is truly measuring the same thing in different cultures.
Our sources point out that even small wording changes can have a big impact. Like, I was really surprised to learn that Hispanic respondents tend to choose more extreme answers on a 5-point scale than Euro Americans do. But then when they use a 10-point scale, that difference goes away.
It's a great example of how just the cultural norms, around how we express our opinions can subtly influence how people answer these test questions.
Hmm.
And researchers have found that sometimes using scales with more points on them can help kind of even out those differences.
That's fascinating. It shows that even something like the number of points on a scale, you have to think about it carefully when you're adapting tests for different cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes a straightforward translation just isn't going to cut it. There are situations where like the very concept they're trying to measure is understood so differently across cultures that researchers have to basically come up with a totally new test from scratch. It's called the assembly option.
Assembly option. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little more? Like, when would researchers choose to go that route?
So imagine you're trying to measure creativity, but the culture you're working with really emphasizes traditional artistic expression more than individual innovation.
Hmm.
So if you used a standard Western creativity test that focuses on, new ideas and being original, it might not work at all.
Ah, I see what you mean.
So in cases like that, researchers might use the assembly option to make a brand new test that's built from the ground up. They would incorporate tasks and stuff that make sense for that culture's specific understanding of creativity,
Mhm.
maybe focusing on mastering traditional art forms or the ability to adapt those forms in meaningful ways. It's really all about respecting those different ways of defining what's being measured.
It sounds like it's a way more involved process than just taking an existing test and translating it.
Oh yeah, definitely. But it's super important for making sure that we're accurately capturing what we're trying to measure within a given cultural context. And it's not just the words that matter.
Yeah.
Either the format of the test itself can introduce bias.
You're so right. I read this really interesting example about drawing tests. Researchers found that Zambian children were much better at making accurate representations using wire models, while British children were better with pen and paper.
That's a classic example of how the format of the test itself can favor certain skills or experiences.
It made me think about all those standardized tests we took growing up. Were those really measuring our abilities, or were they just measuring how familiar we were with a specific way of testing?
That's a really important question, and it just shows how much we need to keep looking closely at how we're testing people. We need to be sure that we're measuring the actual ability, not just someone's comfort level with a certain test format. Think about it. A student who's grown up building things might be amazing at a test that uses 3D models to look at spatial reasoning, even if they struggle with a typical paper and pencil test.
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like there's a lot more to consider than we might initially realize.
Absolutely. And then there's another layer of complexity that we need to talk about too, which is motivation.
Motivation. Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Researchers have found that how a student feels going into a test can significantly affect how they perform.
Really? Like, how so?
Well, one study found that students who thought they were representing their country on a test actually did a lot better than the ones who just saw it as another exam, even if their actual abilities were pretty similar.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like just believing in yourself and knowing how important the task is can actually make a difference in how well you do. But how do researchers account for something as subjective as motivation when they're comparing test scores across different cultures?
It's definitely a challenge, But what researchers are doing more and more is using questionnaires along with test scores to capture these non-cognitive factors. So they're asking about stuff like test anxiety, self-confidence, and how much effort they feel like they put in to get a more complete picture of what the test taker experienced.
That's a really smart approach. It acknowledges that a test score isn't just about your raw ability. It's the result of all these different factors working together, like your motivation and your mindset.
Exactly. And it's even more important when you're dealing with a specific test like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. There was this really interesting study that looked at the Spanish version of the Wechsler and found something pretty unexpected.
Oh, tell me more.
It seemed like Puerto Rican students with more education were actually getting inflated scores compared to their less educated peers.
Wait, that doesn't seem right. Wouldn't you expect more education to always lead to higher scores?
You would think so, but it all comes down to how the test was standardized. The people they used to standardize the Spanish version of the Wechsler were mostly less educated and from rural areas.
So when students with more education take the test they're being compared to a group that doesn't really reflect their background or their experiences.
Exactly. And that can lead to those inflated scores, not because they're necessarily smarter, but because the test isn't really calibrated to their specific demographic. It just shows how important it is to have diverse and representative groups of people when you're standardizing tests.
It seems like we've uncovered a whole bunch of complexities already just in this first part of our deep dive.
Right.
What are some ways that researchers are dealing with all these challenges?
Well, one solution that's gaining some traction is using bilingual people to compare the different versions of a test directly.
Bilingual people. That's interesting. Tell me more about that. How does that work?
So imagine you have someone who can take both the English and Spanish versions of a test and tell you if the questions really mean the same thing.
That would be so useful.
Exactly. They can point out those anchor items, the questions that are truly the same across languages, and help make sure the rest of the test is adjusted properly.
It's like having a cultural and linguistic bridge built right in.
And it's really helpful for making sure things are more accurate and fair in cross-cultural assessment. Now, before we go on to the next part, I want to leave you with something to think about. We talked about translation format, motivation standardization, but what other things might affect how someone does on a test?
That's a great question. And I have a feeling it's about to get even more interesting.
So you asked about what other things, besides what we've talked about, could influence test performance.
I did, and I'm ready to hear what else these sources have to say about it. I mean, it seems like we've already uncovered so much.
Well, our sources really go deep into some interesting stuff. One thing they point out is how cultural values and beliefs can impact how people behave when they're taking a test. Like some cultures are all about cooperation and achieving things as a group, while others are more focused on individual competition.
Right, that makes sense. But how do those values actually show up when someone's sitting down taking a test?
Okay, so imagine a test that requires people to work together. Students from cultures that value teamwork, they probably do really well in that setting, right? But students from cultures that are more individualistic might struggle, even if they have the same skills and knowledge.
You know, I remember reading a study about this where they showed American and Japanese participants an animated underwater scene and asked them to describe what they saw. And the Americans, they tended to focus on the biggest fish in the scene, while the Japanese talked about the background details and how the fish were interacting with the environment.
That's a perfect example. It shows how those deep-seated cultural values can shape how we see things and even how we approach solving problems. Those kinds of differences can definitely have an impact on how people answer test questions.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how many talented people have been overlooked just because their way of thinking didn't match the way the test was designed.
It's something to think about, for sure. That's why researchers are looking more and more at different assessment methods that are more culturally sensitive. Some are even working on tests that use storytelling or real-world problem solving, because those formats might work better for people from certain cultures.
So it's about being creative, not just tweaking existing tests, but coming up with totally new ways of assessing people.
Exactly. It's about tapping into people's potential in a way that aligns with their background and their experiences. And speaking of different perspectives, our sources also highlight how important the examiner is, the person who actually gives the test.
Oh yeah, the human element. We haven't talked about that yet.
Right? Their attitude, their cultural sensitivity, even little nonverbal cues can all affect how comfortable and confident a test taker feels, which can then affect how well they do.
I bet that dynamic is even stronger when the examiner and the test taker are from different cultural backgrounds.
Oh, absolutely. There's actually a phenomenon called stereotype threat, where people from marginalized groups might perform worse on tests if they're aware of negative stereotypes about their group's abilities. And unfortunately, sometimes the examiner's behavior can accidentally reinforce those stereotypes.
That's a tough thing to think about. It seems like making a really welcoming and supportive testing environment is just as important as having a well-designed test.
It's crucial. The examiner needs to be trained in cultural awareness and sensitivity. They need to understand their own biases, and they need to be good at building rapport with test takers from all different backgrounds.
It sounds like being an effective examiner, especially in a cross-cultural context, is a lot more involved than people might realize.
It is. And that's why training and certification programs for examiners are becoming more and more important, especially as our world becomes more diverse and interconnected. And there's another layer to consider too, the socioeconomic context of the person taking the test.
Okay, how does that come into play?
Well, think about it. Things like having access to good education, early childhood experiences, even stuff like nutrition and healthcare can all have a huge impact on someone's cognitive development.
So if you're comparing scores across cultures, you can't just look at the numbers themselves. You have to think about those systemic inequalities that might be at work.
Exactly. Test scores don't always give you the full story about someone's natural abilities. They're often influenced by a whole bunch of social, economic, and environmental factors.
And if you don't account for those factors, you could end up with some pretty inaccurate conclusions.
It'd be like comparing apples and oranges without even acknowledging that they were grown in totally different conditions.
Exactly. These sources are giving us so much to think about. It's like they're saying, hey, look closer. There's way more to this than you might think.
I like that analogy. It's about seeing test scores, not as the end of the story, but as a beginning of a deeper investigation into what shapes human potential. But even with all these things to consider, we need to remember that tests are ultimately just tools. They're made to measure certain things in a specific context.
And even those carefully designed anchor items we were talking about, the questions that are supposed to be truly the same across different languages and cultures, even those aren't totally immune to cultural influences.
You gotta have those can be tricky too. Like a simple question about family relationships could mean something very different in a collectivist culture where extended family is everything, compared to an individualistic culture where the focus is on the nuclear family.
So it seems like no matter how careful we are, there's always a chance of misinterpreting the results if we don't think about the cultural context.
That's why research and collaboration across cultures is so important. We need to always be refining our understanding of how these factors work together and how they impact test performance. But it's not all bad news. There's some really exciting things happening in this field that give us a more hopeful outlook.
Okay, I could definitely use some good news right now. Tell me more about these developments.
Well, one of the most promising trends is the move toward more dynamic and interactive ways of assessing people. So instead of just sticking with those traditional paper and pencil tests, researchers are exploring how technology can be used to create assessments that are more engaging and culturally relevant.
I like that. Give me some examples. How are they using technology to make assessments better?
Imagine virtual simulations where people taking the test can show their skills in real-world situations, or game-based assessments that can be adapted for different cultural contexts. These new tools have the potential to tap into a much wider range of abilities and give us a more nuanced understanding of a person's potential.
I love that idea. It's like taking the best of technology and combining it with cultural understanding to create something truly innovative.
Exactly. And the exciting thing is that this is happening in all kinds of fields, from education to psychology to workplace assessment. There's a growing awareness that in our globalized world, we need assessment tools that are as diverse and dynamic as the people they're supposed to be assessing.
It's about moving beyond the limitations of those old school tests and embracing a more holistic and culturally sensitive approach.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone has unique talents and potential, and then finding ways to help them unlock that potential, no matter what their background is. But before we get too carried away talking about the future of assessment, let's bring it back to our listener for a minute.
Good idea. After all, this information is most useful when we can apply it to our own lives, right?
Absolutely. So listener, here's something to think about. Think about the assessments you've come across in your own life, whether it's in school, at work, or even in your personal relationships. How might cultural factors have played a role in those assessments? And how could a more culturally sensitive approach have led to different outcomes?
That's a powerful question for all of us to consider as we live in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this segment, there's one more important area I want to touch on: the ethics of cross-cultural assessment.
Ethics. Yes, that seems like a huge consideration in this field.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about how test results can have big consequences. They can affect your educational opportunities, your career choices, even your sense of self-worth. If tests aren't culturally fair, they can end up reinforcing inequalities that already exist.
So how do we make sure assessments are being used ethically and responsibly in cross-cultural situations?
Our sources emphasize sticking to ethical guidelines, like the ones from the American Psychological Association. These guidelines cover all sorts of things, from making sure tests are used for the right purpose to protecting the privacy and confidentiality of the people taking them.
Sounds like there's a lot to keep in mind.
There is. And that's why it's so important for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to be talking to each other and working together. We need to constantly be on guard and critical of our approach to assessment, because even with the best intentions, there's always room to do better.
It seems like this is a field that's always changing, just like the world itself. What worked in the past might not work now, and what works in one situation might not work in another.
You got it. It's about embracing the complexity, challenging our assumptions, and being open to new ways of thinking.
I'm feeling pretty inspired by all the innovation and progress that's happening in this field, but I'm also feeling a sense of responsibility. It's clear that cross-cultural assessment isn't just about getting the translations right. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed no matter their background.
Well said. And that commitment to equity is what drives so much of the incredible work that's being done in this field. Now, before we move on to our last segment, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. We've been talking about how cultural factors can affect test scores, but have you ever thought about the other way around? Could the act of taking tests actually shape a culture's understanding of things like intelligence or personality?
Whoa, that's a really interesting question. It's like tests don't just measure culture, they actually influence it too. Yeah, it is kind of mind-blowing, right? We create these tests based on our own cultural ideas, and then those tests actually end up shaping how people within that culture understand those very things. It's like a weird cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the power dynamics involved in testing. Who gets to decide what we measure and how we measure it? Whose definitions of things like intelligence or personality become the standard? And whose voices aren't even being heard.
It's like we're trying to see ourselves in a funhouse mirror and figure out which image is really us and which one is just a distorted reflection.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's so important to have lots of different voices and perspectives involved in every part of the process, from making tests to figuring out what the results mean. We can't just accept the way things are. We need to push for more fairness in how we assess people.
So it's not just a technical challenge, it's a matter of social justice.
Absolutely.
Huh.
How we assess people has real-world consequences.
Mm.
It affects their chances for education, their career options, even how they feel about themselves. If our assessments are biased, then we're just making those inequalities worse.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. But it also shows you just how important the work being done in cross-cultural assessment really is.
Huh?
It's not just about translating things correctly. It's about creating a world where everyone has a fair shot at reaching their full potential, no matter what their background is.
We've come a long way from talking about dominoes on an IQ test to these really big questions about fairness and equity.
And that's what makes this kind of deep dive so interesting, right?
Yeah.
You explore a topic from every angle, find those hidden connections, and come away with new insights.
Before we finish up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the role of bilinguals in evaluating test versions. Our sources really highlighted how valuable their input is.
Oh, for sure. Bilingual people have this amazing ability to bridge two languages and cultures. They can pick up on those tiny shades of meaning that even the best translator might miss.
It's like they have this special key to unlock all those layers of meaning hidden within language.
Exactly. They help make sure that test questions are truly equivalent across cultures, that they capture the right meaning and don't accidentally introduce any cultural bias.
And it's not just about language either. Right? Bilingual people can offer insights into cultural values, traditions, and ways of thinking that might affect how someone approaches a test.
You're absolutely right. Their expertise is so important in creating assessments that are both accurate and culturally sensitive.
So if anyone out there is working on developing or adapting tests, listen up. Get those bilingual experts on board. They're a fantastic resource.
I totally agree. And it's a good reminder that the best solutions often come from working together and being willing to listen to different perspectives.
Well, I think we've just about covered everything there is to say about this topic. Any last words of wisdom before we wrap up?
Just the goal of creating culturally fair assessments is a journey, not destination. It's something we need to keep working on and always be questioning our assumptions.
Very well said. And it's a journey that's worth taking. Because when we create assessments that are truly fair, we create more opportunities for everyone. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of cross-cultural assessment. It's fascinating and complex. We hope you learned something new, maybe challenged some of your own ideas, and came away feeling inspired to help create a more equitable world.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.